Tomsk Airport, July 11, 2011. On Peron, an An-24-passenger aircraft of Angara Airlines is preparing to perform a regular passenger flight 50.07 on the order of Tomsk Avia on the Tomsk-Surgut route. 37 people, 33 passengers, and 4 crew members are boarding the aircraft, and an experienced crew is preparing to fly the An-24 aircraft. The aircraft commander is 48-year-old Andrei Mikhailovich Glizin, the co-pilot, 53-year-old Sergei Grigorievich Smirnov, and the flight mechanic, 47-year-old Sergei Nikolaevich Fizichku, and one stewardessa, 29-year-old, works in the cabin. Victoria Novoke at 10:10 a.m. local time. The dispatcher gives our crew permission to take off, and the An-24 aircraft breaks away from takeoff on the runway of Tomsk Airport and takes the course Surgut. After 1 hour and 26 minutes after takeoff, our plane follows at an altitude of 6,000 meters. As at this time, the chip in the oil of the left engine is triggered in the cockpit, but the engine parameters remain normal. The crew, checking all the indicators, does not notice any deviations and continues the flight. After 4 minutes, the An-24 enters the area of responsibility Nizhnevartovsk Air Traffic Control, and the co-pilot contacts the approach controller. After completing communication with the dispatcher, the commander checks with the co-pilot the distance to Surgut and Nizhnevartovsk. According to the data, the distance to Surgut is 320 kilometers, and to Nizhnevartovsk is 157.8. This time, the crew begins to smell burning in the cabin, and the indicators of the left engine begin to fluctuate. Commander Andrei Glizin decides to immediately leave for the reserve airfield of Nizhnevartovsk. The crew switches the left engine to flight mode low gas and closes the air intake from it. The plane begins to descend. The oil pressure in the left engine gradually begins to decrease, but then it is restored to a minimum value. The crew occupies an altitude of 4,800 meters and receives permission from the dispatcher to further descend to an altitude of 1,800 meters. Allow me to set a course directly for the drive. To shorten the flight time, the dispatcher gives permission to our crew to straighten the route and follow the course to Nizhnevartovsk Airport, but after a few minutes in the process of decline, on at an altitude of 3,600 meters and at a distance of 77 kilometers from the airport Nizhnevartovsk, the light detector is triggered. Dangerous vibration of the left engine. At the command of the commander, the flight mechanic turns off the left engine with the vane of the propeller, closes the fire crane and duplicates the hydroflug. Having visually verified the venting of the propeller off the left engine, the commander notices flames from the engine compartment. At the same time, the fire alarm and the first stage of firefighting are triggered. At the command of the commander, the flight mechanic turns off the pumping pumps and closes the stopcock of the left engine, but the fire continues and soon engulfs the left engine. At 11:53 a.m., 63 kilometers from Nizhnevartovsk, crew reports the fire to the dispatcher. The flight mechanic activates the second stage of firefighting, but the fire cannot be eliminated. Then the commander, seeing that the situation is becoming catastrophic, decides on an emergency descent and an emergency landing on the OP River, which he observes in a break in the clouds. An emergency descent is performed with a left turn and a roll-off more than 32 degrees, having already flown to the water surface before the actual landing. The flight mechanic turns off the right engine with the propeller venting. At 11:56 a.m. at a speed of 240 km per hour, the flight 50.07 drive to the OP River 17 kilometers from the airport Strezhevoye, but at the time of the floods, the left engine partially collapses, and the left landing gear was torn out. During further movement, the liner encountered underwater obstacles. As a result, the skin of the lower part of the fuselage collapsed and, with significant exposure to water pressure, the tail section of the aircraft broke off. The evacuation of passengers took place through the emergency hatch in the cockpit, as well as through the formed fracture of the tail section of the fuselage. All the surviving passengers left the plane on their own with the help of the crew and local residents who came to the rescue, including fishermen on motorboats. 3 ferries from Strezhevoye and 3 helicopters were used to deliver rescuers to the crash site Nizhnevartovsk Avia Airlines. Of those on board the An-24 aircraft, 37 people were killed, 7 passengers, and the remaining 30 people survived. 26 of them, including all 4 crew members, were injured varying degrees of severity. Upon the fact of the disasters of Flight 50-07, criminal proceedings were initiated under the third part of Article 263 of the UKRF, violation of traffic safety rules and operation off railway, air or water transport. The West Siberian Transport Prosecutor's Office concluded During the inspection that the crashed plane should not have been allowed to fly. 2 Guilty officials were brought to disciplinary responsibility. I conducted a technical investigation of the causes of the disaster. The Interstate Aviation Committee. On December 11, 2013, the IAC published the final report of the investigation. The crash of the An-24 aircraft occurred during an emergency landing on water, the need for which was caused by a fire in the motorcycle nacelle of the AI-24 left engine. The destruction of the aircraft with the loss of life occurred due to the collision of the aircraft with underwater obstacles, which the crew could not have foreseen and prevented. The occurrence of the fire was most likely the result of depressurization of the left engine venting system due to a violation of the CC-24 centrifugal venting, followed by the release of an air oil emulsion into the engine compartment, as well as the untimely shutdown of the crew engine at the first appearance of an alarm. The reason for the destruction of the centrifugal breather was the destruction of its impeller due to prolonged exposure to air oil emulsion, with an increased temperature due to the destruction of the bearing ball of the rear support of the compressor rotor. Significant secondary damage to the parts of the compressor rotor rear support assembly did not allow us to unambiguously determine the cause of the bearing failure. Most likely, the destruction occurred during its operation with an increased skew of the rings. With the contributing factors of an aviation accident, the most likely was the commander's psychological readiness to turn off the engine in flight due to lack of experience in real flights with an idle engine and the late detection of a fire, and, as a result, failure to take temporary measures to extinguish the fire. Unfortunately, due to the lack of objective information, it is necessary to determine the cause of the fire of the crew, including to fully assess the operability of all elements in the system fire alarm. It was not possible. 2 Members of the Commission published a dissenting opinion, which pointed out the problems of triggering fire alarms and shortcomings in the flight operation manual of the An-24 aircraft, which in their opinion they were the factors of the disaster. The day of mourning in the Tomsk region was not announced, because on July 12, the all-Russian day of mourning for the victims of the Bulgarian ship disaster has already been appointed. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev at a meeting on the day of the plane crash said it was necessary to assess the action of the crew, because they can be interpreted in different ways, but in general, if the crew acted grammatically, then this is rather an occasion to celebrate the crew for the fact that they managed to come down and save a fairly significant number of lives. Nevertheless, not so long ago I spoke about the state of our air fleet. Everything that I said in relation to the Tu-134 no less applies to their An-24 aircraft. Given that we are changing the fleet of aircraft, I propose to extend the same approaches to the An-24. This statement, which implied in the basis of this, the possibility of removing An-24 aircraft from service in regular passenger flights since 2012 has been criticized by experts who noted that to prep area replacement for those flying in Russia as of the middle of the year in 2011, it is impossible for almost 124 aircraft in such a short period of time. In the end, it was decided to introduce in 2012 there are restrictions on the operation of domestically produced aircraft that are not equipped with ground and air collision warning systems. Also, in this whole incident, I want to note an interesting fact. The wreckage of the plane began to be lifted out of the water only after 8 days. When it came to the cabin, a previously lost cat named Daisy jumped out. She ran away into the forest and came to people only a month and a half later. In that plane crash, the cat Daisy risked death more than once. She could have crashed against the bars of the flight deck at the time of a hard landing, drowned in the water. She could have starved to death in a flooded plane or while wandering through the woods, but she managed to avoid all this. Maybe cats really have 9 lives of friends. What do you think about this issue? Be sure to share it in the comments, and also subscribe to the channel and like this video. See you soon, friends.